I went to a Dutch-American symposium at New York Society for Ethical Culture on October 6th, 7th, 2019. It was called Humanism Across the Atlantic, Looking for Common Ground. At this symposium, Dr. Philip Kitcher from Columbia University made a presentation on humanism and religious progress. In his presentation, he talks a little bit about the new atheists and also about making religious progress to improve morality of significant beings.
So it's a very wimpy title, and I am a wimp about matters of religion and humanism. But actually, exactly 10 years ago, at one of the celebrations of the Darwin bicentennial, I was sitting at breakfast with a friend of mine, a staunch new atheist, and we had quite an amicable argument, which closed when he said, "You know, I'm going to give you a new title. You're the Pope of the I'm an Atheist but movement." And I'm happy to accept that title. So what follows you can think of as an encyclical or possibly just a piece of papal bull. It comes from the conviction that something has gone badly wrong with public discourse in the United States in particular, I think also in Britain, and to a lesser extent in other places. There has been a new debate between the forces of religion, variously conceived, and the forces of atheism. And in fact, there are two debates, I think, and they're both distorted. The first one, which is perhaps the most prominent, concerns the credibility of religious doctrines. The second one, which I think is profoundly important, more important, is whether religion can be relied upon as a fundamental source of moral guidance. And I think the distortions of the first debate are getting in the way of profitable pursuit of the second. And so I'm going to start with new atheist fundamentalism, as I see it. This is the sort of position advocated by my friend, who is, if you like, a Bolshevik to my Menshevik attitude. Nothing is worse than believing something that's false. Being conned is the worst thing that could possibly happen to a person. Being deprived of grasping the Darwinian view of life is a great tragedy. We are now back in the territory that Anjan and Peter were exploring early this morning, the distortion of American humanism by the obsession with making sure that high school students can learn about Darwinism. Well, it's a bad thing if they don't, but it isn't really one of the world's greatest tragedies. The second debate, which is the moral debate, is, I think, the really important one. And that debate turns on whether religious texts can be seen as authoritative with respect to moral matters that concern the general public. The use of those texts in history has sometimes been profoundly oppressive, marginalizing people and subjecting them to all kinds of hideous practices. So the point that non-believers tend to make in this debate is one that's appreciated, to be sure, by the new atheists, but it's been appreciated by all those who've resisted religious interference in moral matters for a very, very long time. Now, often when one starts talking about religion in public discussions of moral matters, the response is to try to be pacific about this. So there's a kind of pacifism that people influenced sometimes by very great philosophers like John Rawls appeal to, which is the appeal to democracy. So in a democratic society, it's sometimes said, our public discussions must only appeal to premises that other parties can accept. And so in a multicultural, multi-religious society where some people a few people perhaps are not religious. You can't appeal to religious premises. And I think religious people, people who are profoundly religious, including people who have the kind of spiritual and moral conception of religion, perhaps exemplified by Anjan's father, might say, no, there's something fundamentally wrong with this argument. It fails to come to terms with the depth, centrality, and importance of the religious. Why should democracy take precedence over the demands of religion? So I think this pacific approach, often moved by considerations of diplomacy, is actually wrong. I think one needs to take a stronger stance here. So I'm going to be a little bit less wimpish for a minute. The better response is simply to say that appealing to religious authorities, scriptures, religious leaders, and so forth, often introduces moral falsehoods. It often leads to conclusions that certain things should be followed. There are, in fact, moral errors, and they cause much harm to many different kinds of people. And they tend to come sometimes from the most tribal elements in our religious practices of today. So if you look at religion today, around the world, and in the United States and in other affluent countries, there are still these strands of tribal religion which have endured in contemporary religion. Deities are sometimes seen as glorified chieftains, and morality flows from their preferences, the things they want. Now, a lot of contemporary religion has gone beyond that. It's become more ecumenical. It's liberated religion from tribalism and tolerated alternative religious practices. It's allowed the independence of morality. This is an important theme in what I'm going to say. I want to talk about religious progress in these terms, in terms of a move from the primitive and the tribal to the basically ecumenical, to a deeper kind of ecumenical religion, and beyond that to something with which secular humanists can probably be pretty comfortable. But I want to suggest that the alliance between humanism in its secular forms and religion can be far broader than appreciated. And by broadening that alliance, and here again I'm resonating with things that Anjan said at the start of his talk, by making that alliance broader, the chances for a fairer, juster world, a world perhaps in which humanism in its broadest forms may start to thrive more than it has done, may become possible. Now, progress? Religion? Progress? Well, not towards any long-term goal. There isn't an ideal true religion towards which the religions of the world are tending, but progress in many domains is often progress from an unsatisfactory state. I'll give you a trivial example. Many of you own smartphones. Smartphone technology makes progress, but there is no Platonic form of the smartphone that is dimly glimpsed by people emerging from the caves of the laboratories in which they dwell into the bright light of Silicon Valley. That is a myth. There is no ideal smartphone. What progress in smartphone technology consists of is getting rid of the glitches and overcoming the limitations, doing more things with your smartphone. Religious progress is like that. It's getting rid of the primitive bits, of solving the problems of the past and expanding the limitations. So I'm going to offer you a thesis. I think the new atheist goal of eradicating religious doctrine from the face of the earth is beside the point. We don't need to get rid of it all. What people believe in private can safely be left to them. What's problematic is the intrusion of that into the public domain. So our aim should be to improve public debate by freeing discussions of moral issues from the supposed authority of religion and by developing a humanist and humane system of ethics for the public sphere. So this project, I think, can be advanced by an alliance between secular humanism and progressive forms of religion. Many more, perhaps, than people who call themselves secular humanists have realized. And that isn't just a matter of good diplomacy. It's a matter of intellectual honesty, recognizing what is fundamental to these debates, which have gotten so badly screwed up by all the screaming that's gone on. So, let me talk a bit about progressive religions. They're ecumenical. They recognize differences over moral issues. They favor independent discussions of debated moral questions, discussions that focus on the human. Yesterday afternoon, Monica told us how the philosophical tradition didn't speak to contemporary black people in the United States, and that's readily understandable because a lot of the people in that tradition wrote in a highly abstract way, and a lot of them also said appalling things about the ancestors of those young men who appeared in the videos yesterday. And one of them, none more abstract and certainly not sort of racially sensitive, was Immanuel Kant. And yet, we should not throw away the Enlightenment because it has general insights for us today. And one of them is stated in Kant's groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. He writes, "Every example," he says it in German, of course, "of morality that is presented to me must itself first be judged according to principles of morality, whether it's actually worthy to serve as an original example, i.e. as a model. But by no means can it furnish the concept of it at the outset. Even the Holy One of the Gospel must first be compared with our ideal of moral perfection before he is recognized as one." Without that independent standard, we cannot accept any teacher or commander's views of what to do. We must appraise the commander first. Now let me give you a quick review of things that are in the scriptures that most Jews and Christians, I won't deal with the Quran or with the Bhagavad Gita or with the noble truths of Buddhism. I'll just concentrate on Judeo-Christianity. People should smite neighbors they don't like. And when they do so, they should collect the foreskins of the males. In James Joyce's great novel Ulysses, the character Buck Mulligan refers to the deity as the collector of prepuces. It's always struck me as a lovely bit of Joycean blasphemy. And then you take the nubile women as concubines. It's crucial also to respect the exact proportions for the tabernacle and to follow the exact specifications for sacrifices laid down in the Book of Numbers. The Book of Numbers is really worth reading. It makes you think, what kind of deity is really so concerned with all these details? Things some Christians continue to believe, that those who fail to hold the correct set of religious beliefs will be doomed to an everlasting life of excruciating torment. And for those of you who like Ulysses, you probably also like the great series of 4 sermons in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, drawn from a 19th century religious tract, which, as it were, terrify the young Stephen Dedalus with a vision of what this torment is going to be like. And that sentence will be administered however virtuous their conduct. Many devout people would draw the line at least some of this. They would recognize some of the moral precepts of the scriptures as cruel and savage, and yet they continue to view those very texts, those scriptures, as authoritative on quite controversial moral matters, like abortion and gay marriage. They filter their favored religious texts. They choose the bits to follow and reject some other bits. Thoroughly ecumenical religion abandons that idea of filtering the text. It realizes that some things should not be done even if they're commanded by the text, because they are cruel and savage. And in doing that, they recognize an independent moral standard, applied in principle, consistently. That's Kant's insight. But many people who are religious people think that there is a reply to Kant. It's a very popular reply, and it runs through a lot of the reliance on religious texts. You can evade Kant's insight. You don't need to assess the moral authority of the scriptures because they are the word transmitted to people in the past of the creator of the cosmos. We should follow the creator's plan for his creation and the principles expressed in the divine word. For the creator is vaster, more omnipotent, more omniscient, more far-seeing than we are. Or, as the bumper sticker puts it, and I take it you've probably seen this on a bumper sticker at some time, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. Think about that for a moment. There's this divine being, set up the whole show. We should follow his word, whatever our own moral views are, except in those cases where it's really clear that something's gone wrong. We've been here before. On the left is the rail line leading into Auschwitz, and on the right is a picture of life in a Soviet gulag. Now, in both of these instances, the people who ran those local camps received orders from a central authority. So consider the predicament of the commandant, who, after the show is all over, has to defend himself. What does he say? Well, we obeyed the leaders. They were powerful. They set up the system. They saw much further than we did. It was not our place to question them. It rings hollow. But maybe a more thoughtful commandant is a bit like today's filtering religious believer. That believer rejects orders to torture, kill, and smite. No, something's gone wrong there. When the text says that, no, but allows the leader's orders to settle controversial matters, like whether to administer harsh punishments. The commandant no longer sends the inmates of the camp to the gas chambers, maintains the dietary rules, maintains the work rules, maintains a harsh system of punishments, or in the religious case, prohibits abortion or gay marriage. But the thoughtful commandant is not thoughtful enough. Some of the leader's orders command unspeakable things. That means the leader can't be relied on in moral matters and can't be trusted to resolve difficult moral questions. The commandant has to think for himself. What has the leader in the religious case commanded? Violence against neighbors, sexual slavery, murder of children, and, in a delicate twist, forgiveness of enemies so that their eternal torments will be increased. And supposedly the leader now says, abortion is always prohibited. We have to have a law against it. Even when the pregnant person is a 12-year-old girl raped by her father, carrying a fetus so genetically constituted that any resultant baby could only live a brief life of excruciating agony, and when the life of the girl will itself be snuffed out as she gives birth. Never? Well, once you open the door, you're forced to ask, where? And how should we encourage moral reflection on the difficult cases of terminating a pregnancy in such a way that the actions will be humane, will be moved by the kinds of values that Peter and Anya have both talked about in their accounts of humanism? We have to open that door. A commandant cannot say, I follow my leader in this, because what is being commanded comes from an authority that is not reliable, and sometimes apparently commands outrageous things. The commandant should see that any leader of that sort shouldn't be followed. But in fact, I've made it easy, because the religious person in contemporary society is actually in a worse epistemic position than the commandant. The commandant at Auschwitz or in the Gulag is following a single leader. There's a single source of authority, and the orders transmitted are usually completely clear and unambiguous. Not always, but usually. One of the things about the records in both the cases is the pains that the central authorities took to make sure that those who administered the death camps were given unambiguous instructions. But that's not so with respect to the religious counterpart of that. So we would have to envisage a commandant of a different kind, who knows that there's a power struggle at the highest level of the central authority. There are different factions, and the instructions given are often cryptic and obscure. There are many ways to interpret the orders that are passed down. And perhaps within the same system of Nazi camps or Soviet work camps in the Gulag, different camp leaders interpret these orders differently. That further weakens the idea that what comes down must be followed as morally authoritative. And so you might say, well, the leader is perhaps absent and has removed himself from the scene. Other business is pressing, and the leader has to get on with it, and that's why we get all of this confusion. So the management has been left to competing factions. Doesn't that further redound to the moral failure of the leader? The further you pursue this analogy, the worse it gets. So I want to say Kant's insight is a very deep one. Selective reliance on the scriptures as moral authorities is a moral error. And that leads me to the second and more positive part of my talk. Some religions recognize this conclusion, and they begin to understand the independence of morality from religion. This is a really important mode of religious progress. If you were tempted to think that I'd gone soft in the head when I talked about religious progress earlier, I want to invite you to think about this for a moment. It really is a wonderful progressive step in the history of religion when people start recognizing that you have to do your moral thinking in human terms. So tribal religion invokes deities who are leaders. They tend to help the local group in its struggles, especially in conflicts with the neighbors. The gods are, it's a resonant phrase, it still exists in the contemporary religion, they're jealous gods. The attitude seems to be, my God is bigger than your God, which perhaps is why the guy who dictates the instructions in Numbers is so incredibly narcissistic. Now, ecumenical religion gets beyond that. At the first stage, it introduces the idea, it stays with the idea, that the doctrines of our particular religion are uniquely correct. But it gives up on the thought that the neighbors should be smitten because they don't agree with us. So there's a relaxation of violence against people with different religious beliefs. We shouldn't attack them, even though we could try and should try to convert them. Do it peaceably. But at the end of the day, if we don't succeed in converting them, they are still going to suffer. Other religions err so deeply that their adherents deserve severe divine punishment. Except where they command violence towards unbelievers, our scriptures offer proper moral guidance. Now, if you reflect on this package for a moment and think about the contemporary scene in the United States, there are obvious religious denominations in this country that have moved beyond this stage of ecumenical religion. But equally, many of the religions that call themselves evangelical in this country haven't. This is the package of doctrines they accept. They've gotten this far, but no further. They've given up on the smiting and the collecting of foreskins, but they haven't given up on the general idea of appealing to the scriptures as sources of moral guidance. They are the sorts of people who flaunt that bumper sticker that I showed you earlier. Now, many religious people in our past have thought that we should go a little bit further than that we should act as God's soldiers, if not by smiting the neighbors, at least in other domains. So, here's Cotton Mather from colonial slavery days. The state of your Negroes in this world must be low and mean and abject, a state of servitude. No great things in this world can be done for them. Something then let there be done towards their welfare in the world to come. Every one of us shall give account of himself to God. Okay. In the early 18th century, there is a movement that considers the enslavement of Africans as a moral duty. It is informed or misinformed by something the Portuguese knew, but the Yankee sea captains apparently didn't. Namely, that they weren't coming from a state of utter disaster and depravity in Central Africa, but that they were coming from functional societies. Cotton Mather and his friends didn't know that, and so they thought, how sincerely it's impossible to say, that the Middle Passage and enslavement were essential for the salvation, the religious salvation of the Negro people. It's a terrible thought, and it shows the incursion of religious ideas into moral thinking with disastrous consequences. But even though fundamentalist religion, evangelical religion is still stuck at that first ecumenical stage, there are, I think, a large and significant number of religious believers in our society who've gone one stage further, to a second stage of ecumenical religion. They continue to believe that the doctrines of their particular religion are uniquely correct. But they pledge themselves to the independence of morality. They reject the idea that Scripture should be followed wherever. Even when Scripture appears to command them, violations of morality are never justified. And perhaps that goes along with the idea that those with false religious beliefs will ultimately be forgiven, that religious quarrels are something that can be put behind them. And finally, an explicit statement of the principle that morality is independent of religion, that religious texts can't be used as reliable guides in moral discussions. The moral issues have to be worked out independently. Now, these people are people with whom, it seems to me, humanists can start to do serious business. There's a potential instability in the position. Deviant religions are now forgiven. There's no terrible penalty to be paid for believing the wrong things. But I think recognizing that might lead believers to reflect on whether their own doctrines are plausibly claimed as uniquely correct. One of the great things that came out of the Enlightenment and arose throughout the 19th century was the recognition of epistemic symmetries among religions. the ways in which religions have grown and evolved and passed on their doctrines are broadly similar. It's really very, very hard for the religious believer, I think, to say, well, my religion is uniquely right and yours is wrong. So I think the thoughtful religious believer should go beyond second stage ecumenical religion. Recognize doctrinal symmetry as well as moral symmetry. And that leads to a position that I called in a previous book I wrote on secular humanism, refined religion. None of the world's religions is uniquely correct. All religions are necessarily limited attempts to gesture towards the transcendent aspects of reality. Their scriptures should be read non-literally. Perhaps this is the sort of position that shades off into what Anjan called ersatz religion. Many people for whom I've talked about refined religion say, well, it's not really religion at all, is it? But the thought is that there's something beyond the material world. William James put it beautifully in terms of the great unheard symphony. Right? There's this something that is larger and bigger and higher, or something like that, than us. And religion gestures towards it. And that provides something important for human lives, namely, the religious response to the transcendent is uniquely enriching. And again, the independence of morality from religion. Now, as you look at that, I suspect you can say, well, these people are even closer. Except they've got it wrong because, as Peter pointed out yesterday and as Anya reiterated today, actually humanity is enough. Peter suggested something yesterday that I'm going to rephrase. He may not like the rephrasing, but that it's not that the brotherhood or sisterhood or siblinghood or whatever of humanity rests on our connection to some, as it were, greater being or some transcendent something or another. That's not what makes humans important. Humans just are important. That's the end of the matter. That's fundamental. The lateral connections are enough. We don't need a vertical link through something allegedly higher. Now, I think that's exactly right. I'm a secular humanist. But you can see how that addendum to secular humanism doesn't get much in the way of anything important. So I think there's a natural alliance between proponents of refined religion and secular humanists. We should be deploring fundamentalism in religion and in new atheism, and our residual disagreement really centers on this idea of whether there's this extra something that gives a unique enrichment. That's not a big deal. But over breakfast in Cambridge a decade ago, my new atheist friend says, so you get these guys who believe in refined religion as allies. Yeah, all 10 of them. How many new divisions will the Pope have, eh? Well, not very many. I mean, what I've called refined religion is sometimes thought of as liberal theology in various traditions. And there are not that many people who are in that particular camp. So, why don't we broaden the alliance? After all, if the second debate is the important one, the one that covers the role of morality in public discussion, then already at the second stage of ecumenical religion, the crucial step has been taken. So see, religious texts can't be used as reliable guides in moral discussions. Moral issues have to be worked out independently. Second stage ecumenical people have already got there. And that principle survives in refined religion and in secular humanism. And that, I think, is what we urgently need. So, I want to close by suggesting that the humanist movement should stay away from concerns about the truth of particular metaphysical doctrines. Those needn't occupy us. What is absolutely crucially important at this stage of human life is, it seems to me, to introduce the most general and fundamental humanist moral perspective into our moral thinking. And to get there, you've got to clear the debris out of the way. As the discussion between Anjan and Peter proceeded, I was moved to think that one of the great things about inquiry, the use of reason, the use of science, and so forth, is that it clears the debris out of the way. It gets rid of the stuff that clutters things up. And it seems to me that what needs to be done here is to engage in a concerted argument about the need for a humane morality, collectively worked out, but collectively worked out in the absence of any idea that religious texts can provide absolute authority. Think about the ways in which our public moral discussions might be transformed if we could attain that goal. I'm a firm believer in deliberative democracy. I'm a firm believer in that democracy as involving the requirement to represent all different perspectives, and particularly to listen out for those that have been oppressed in the past. We should, as William James, I'm quoting him again, said, listen for the cries of the wounded. We really should be listening for the cries of the wounded in our public moral discussions. But it's essential to remove a particular obstacle. The obstacle that says, no, on principle, you can't do this because it is forbidden by a religious text. So I think this is a plea, really, a plea to try to broaden this alliance, because what strikes me as fundamentally dangerous and wrong in our age is the character of the public moral debate. That's what we should be concentrating on. And New Atheism is not just a sideshow. It is, as I think Anjan already hinted, didn't say it explicitly, it is profoundly counterproductive. So I'll leave you with that and welcome any questions. I don't know, and you're going to have to do.
Thank you for that, and I appreciate you and Anjan, as well as others, giving a platform on the podium to recognizing that there's room to say that other religion can have a partnership with atheism, because I often I began to feel uncomfortable with just dismissing and the people around me who I know have and acknowledged have gotten something positive out of their own beliefs. And so the words that I've chosen to use in my own boots on the ground, grassroots kind of conversation is to acknowledge in words, using the term coping strategies, that these are your coping strategies in life. It's not mine, but it's something that I understand works for you. And, in my own belief, as long as it's not being used to, in the community or politics or whatever, so I've tended to show more respect out of that. And I was wondering if there was any other kinds of words and phrases to use in conversation where we can have a little bit more of respect to acknowledge the people around us.
I think I think it's terribly important to show respect. Look, I live on the Upper West Side, very close to Harlem. Whenever I'm walking through Harlem, and I look at all of those little storefront churches, and I see the elderly women, because they are mostly elderly women who have put on their best to go to those churches. And I know from my reading, I know from sort of some of the things that I've learned about the role that those women have sometimes played in the community, and the role that those churches have indirectly and sometimes directly played in the community as sources of strength. And one should have profound respect for that. One should have profound respect, it seems to me, for the ways in which, at various stages, religion has been a powerful social force for justice in this country and elsewhere. There's religion and religion. And there is the kind of religion, unfortunately, which will not bow to independent moral judgment and will demand conformity to supposedly absolute principles. And it's it's the break between that and the religion that is oriented always towards justice and towards an independent morality. That seems to me the crucial step in dividing the religions that are worthy of respect from those that ought to be resisted.
Hi. You said that moral issues have to or should be worked out independently of religion. If that's the case, what's the point of religion?
So, for the religious believer, it seems to me that the religious aspects of the world are supposed to give depth to our moral life. They're supposed to do two things. First of all, they're supposed to fill out and extend and enrich our understandings of those moral principles. They are not, as it were, sources of them, but they are nonetheless ways in which those moral principles can be seen in action. So I think, I will talk about Christianity because it's the religion in which I grew up. Somebody who takes the kind of stance that I'm attributing to advanced ecumenical religion, second stage ecumenical religion, can freely go on to say, yes, this is an independent moral principle. It's because I recognize this independent fact of morality that I see Jesus as having particularly important things to say. And I see in the pattern of the life of Jesus and in some of the things that he said to his followers, I see ways of developing these moral points. They don't go beyond what is in them, but they make the moral points more vivid for me, and they give me something that goes beyond a mere statement of abstract principle. They show me how that principle can be applied in moral life. So the other thing they would say is, and they give me a deeper sense of purpose than I would have if I thought that my life was just contributing to the lives of other human beings. So the humanist tradition that I associate with Utrecht has this view that our lives become meaningful, richer, and bigger through the contributions we make to the lives of other human beings. And the religious believer says, that's true, they do, but they attain their ultimate meaning as part of a much bigger divine plan that takes not only our own finite lives, but the finite existence of our species and goes beyond even that. They give it something grander than that. I don't believe in that something grander. I think the humanist perspective is the right one here. But I can see what the religious believer is trying to say here. So there are these two sort of extra things that it seems to me are available as value added on from the religious perspective, if I can put it that way. It's a very good question, but I think, yeah, do you want to follow up?
Separate question, but thank you for answering that. You said that humans are just important. Are you comparing that to the importance of other living creatures like animals and everything else that we're obviously exploiting?
No. I'm actually, I'm quite prepared to believe that animals are also important. It's very hard to say why animals are important. I think animals are important because they have certain kinds of similarities to us, actually. They have similar sensitivities, and that's what makes them important. Okay. And to the extent that they don't share those similarities, they become less important. So I'm somebody who can quite cheerfully eat scallops. I don't worry about eating scallops, but I'd never eat an octopus. So yeah, I want to go beyond. But the idea is that there's something about our relationships that's valuable, whether or not the value comes from the fact that we're all brothers or sisters or siblings of a common father or mother or whatever. Okay? Good.
Thank you very much. That was a really interesting talk. I was thinking as you were speaking about the undermining of religious authorities that cannot be depended upon morally, and I'm thinking especially about the Islamic world where you have dictators who use religious figures. But then you also have incredibly rich traditions within popular culture of mocking the sheikh, the figure of the sheikh. So I was wondering if you could speak to the role of art in pushing a society, and I noticed you mentioned Joyce a lot, of the role of art and extending freedom of expression to Muslim majority countries in order to move religions to become more ecumenical and hopefully to the position of morality becoming separate from
well, look, that's terrific, but I'm actually going to take one side of what you said. I'm not going to talk about Islam, but because I don't know enough about it. But one thing I would like to do is make a general point about the role of art in social thinking, in morality, and in our self-understandings. I'm somebody who really, like Anjan, appreciates the value of the sciences, but I also think that the arts and literature in particular are tremendously important for the development of our moral thinking and for the development of our moral sensitivities. So John Dewey, my philosophical hero, says towards the end of his great book, Experience in Nature, that in fact moral conceptions have been brought home to people less by the professional discursive moralists and much more by the artists. Musicians, painters, these days filmmakers, surely. But particularly he thinks poetry, fiction, and drama. And there are very direct and obvious examples of that. I mean, you can think of Dickens and the effect that Dickens had on social movements in Victorian Britain. You can think of Harriet Beecher Stowe, whether or not Lincoln actually said, "So you're the little woman who started this great war." You can think of George Orwell. But you can also think of all sorts of other works of literature that I'm a great fan of many poets, from Shakespeare through Wordsworth to T.S. Eliot, and I think there are huge insights into self-understanding, possibilities for human living, including possibilities of human living together, and for our moral understanding in the works of the poets. So absolutely. And I think this is not something that's necessarily restricted to what one might think of as high art. I think it's also there in many, many genres. And, you know, I mean, yesterday Monica talked about hip hop, and there may be things in that that really uniquely speak to the senses of fulfillment and to the self-understandings of the black youth who figured in those videos. So, absolutely. I mean, the arts and the humanistic interpretation of the arts, I think. So it's not just, I mean, it seems to me that philosophy has neglected this for too long, but there are signs that philosophers are starting to do it again, which is the work of art communicates something, and a philosophical analysis to it, especially one that is ethically inspired, can say, look here, see what's going on here. So the philosopher serves as a kind of commentator in dialogue with the work of art to facilitate the broad appreciation. So to go to the, you know, the hip hop example again, somebody whom I'd hoped would become a colleague at Columbia but who decided to stay at Harvard, Tommy Shelby, has written about the role of hip hop and its philosophical significance for black culture.
Thanks so much, Philip. Something you said towards the end was kind of exhilarating for me when you said that humanism should stay away from metaphysical debates that, you know, clutter things with a lot of unnecessary debris. That really crystallized something for me, which I think goes back to where you started with this sort of Rawlsian idea that, you know, the only premises that are acceptable for debate in a democratic society are ones that are universally agreed among the participants to debate. And this actually made me think that there's a kind of logical error that the militant atheist is making. And I want to bounce this off you and see what you think. It has to do with the kind of inference that they're suggesting from their position to the kinds of values that we might share as humanists. So the error is in thinking that there's some kind of unique relation between a premise, namely atheism, and a conclusion, that is a bunch of humanistic goods, right? Things that we might value or want, right? It turns out that that's mistaken, right? There are bunches of different premises that might lead to humanistic goods, right? And atheism may figure in some of those sets of propositions. It may not figure in other of those sets of propositions. And once you understand this, right, then that really suggests, I think, a challenge to the kind of militant atheist to really clarify what it is that they're advocating, what it is that they are trying to show, right? It's a kind of a dilemma. If what they're arguing for is atheism, well then all of the considerations of humanistic goods are strictly speaking irrelevant. I mean, the narrow debate about atheism is going to turn on what you described as debris. I mean, there are a lot of metaphysical debates. Yep. If instead what they're really hoping to argue for or advocate are humanistic values, well then in that case, it doesn't really turn on atheism per se.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And so they really have to, I think, clarify for themselves what it is that they're trying to advocate and then get clear on what would constitute a good argument for that. And I just wonder whether you think that's a fair diagnosis of what both of us are saying.
I think it is. I mean, look, it's overlain with a complexity, which is that some of them think that you can derive from an appropriate set of scientifically established conclusions, all sorts of value theoretic conclusions. I mean, Harris is famous for this, but Dawkins, it seems to me, is is inclined at least to flirt with it. Dennett is clear that that's not so, but he is an outlier among so that's one source of complexity here. I think the other source is that and this came out with the interaction you had with Peter earlier, that there's a certain sense in which what drives the new atheism, and this is explicit at times, is the thought that children are being abused by being given these false beliefs. I suspect a lot of children in religious families don't get abused. And even if they get taught in their early lives that the earth was created on BC 4004 on a Thursday afternoon or whenever it was, that doesn't seem to me to do a vast amount of damage. I mean, it's not up there with other forms of child abuse. And I mean, Dawkins, I think, is so struck by his own happy ability to love the natural world as seen through a Darwinian lens, that that's so wonderful for him that he wants everybody to share it. I mean, this is a very odd, in a way, it's a very odd kind of fundamentalist wanting to force a kind of pattern onto other people's lives. One might think that the people for whom that's going to be really central to their self-fulfillment are relatively rare. I'm prepared to believe it's central to Dawkins' self-fulfillment, but lots of people find fulfillment in many, many other different ways. So I don't think that the worst thing that can be done to people is to deprive them of the ability to see the world through Darwinian spectacles.
Philip, thank you so much for your talk. It was fascinating, and I have so many ideas, so I'm now thinking I will just write you, and we can maybe have a dialogue over email, or we can talk over lunch. But I have 3 very brief comments, and I'm just wondering if I can think with you about them and have you kind of speak to them. One involves, I can't help but to think this is an occasion where communities are coming, across the Atlantic, right, to have a transatlantic kind of
I'm not hearing you.
to have a transatlantic conversation.
Yeah.
And because the category of religion, much like race, is such a modern invention, and it's so young in a lot of ways, in what ways can we not afford to leave the category race out of the conversation when we're talking about the refinement or lack of refinement when it comes to the category of religion? My second comment has to do, or question has to do with, why ecumenical rather than something like interfaith? And I'm just thinking, about how the manner in which ecumenical really privileges Christianity in a lot of ways.
Oh, yeah, okay, interesting.
It privileges Christianity, and therefore it leaves out a lot of those other traditions that might be seen as more tribal, but actually offer something of great humanist value to the conversation. So I'm wondering why ecumenical rather than interfaith. That can then include, other traditions like Buddhism, other traditions that are just as maybe tribal and primitive, but just as ancient and just as valuable. And then the third comment has to do with your overconfidence in the idea of progress. I don't want to throw out the category of religion either. It's how I make my bread and butter as a scholar of religion. But it traffics in so much that I'm just wondering how we, what types of refined religion do you have in mind? When I think of refined religion, I have in mind, say, groups such as the nuns, for example, a growing group that tries to sort of get beyond supernatural aspects of religion or transcendent notions of religion, folk that are struggling to live in community across lines of multiplicity and social difference. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just wondering if you can briefly speak to some of those aspects.
Okay, so it's going to be difficult to be brief in response to those. Yeah. So let me start with the worries about progress. I'm actually in the process of writing not only one book, but several books trying to rehabilitate the notion of progress understood in pragmatic terms, non-teleologically, and relating it really to the thought that, well, let me just put it this way, that the arc of history may bend away from injustice, that we may make progress by overcoming and releasing the factors that confine human lives. So that's the sense of progress the most fundamental sense. And religion and science and education and in principle economic institutions are all institutions that can contribute to this, but can also be centered on false goals that interfere with progress in other domains, and that block what would otherwise be advantages and advances for us. So that's that question. Ecumenical, you're completely right. I mean, it does, I suppose, have Christian overtones. I had never thought about it. But I certainly didn't want to suggest that this was something that starts with Christianity and then we start embracing. I mean, I think actually of the Romans as being profoundly ecumenical. I mean, religion was so thin at some times in the Roman Empire that, you know, you can have a pantheon. Oh, we've conquered a new people. Well, their gods can come in too. I mean, that really is the terribly easygoing. Should it be called relaxed religion? But that's a very good point. And now, with respect to race, I mean, you're completely correct in thinking that the ways in which the category of race gets used. This is something that I've done some work on and thought about. And you probably know, in the last 20 years, there's been more philosophical progress on the concept of race. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. I mean, the people like me who are writing about race and beginning this sort of venture in the 90s, I mean, the work that's being done now by critical race theory and by, it's stunningly good. And I often say to people who think that philosophy never makes progress, have you looked at what people are saying about topics like race and gender? Because it's so much more sophisticated than it was even 20 years ago. But of course, this needs to be understood. I mean, you could see me tiptoeing a little bit in this direction by bringing up Cotton Mather, because I wanted to, as it were, show how in that particular context religion and race interacted oppressively. But in response to no, it wasn't. It was in response to an early question. Maybe it was your question in the front row about the ladies in Harlem, right? I mean, there is a style of religion there which is immensely worthy of respect, it seems to me.
In the Netherlands, some humanists say things like true Christianity, true Islam is the tribal version of it. And I think that humanist positions like this are helping the worst kinds of religion, and they are letting down possible allies in the religious camp. So that's one of the things I want to know what you think about this. Another one is, I remember in South Africa, Bishop Tutu saying, the laws of God are more important than the laws of human beings. And he meant that the apartheid laws made by human beings should be corrected. And he said the laws of God are more important, but as a humanist, I think the moral laws are more important than those apartheid laws. And I think that a humanist should support Bishop Tutu when he says something like, in that context, the laws of God are more important than the laws of men. And I had heavy discussions with other humanists. They didn't agree at all. But I also want to know what you think about this. And the last thing is that I think there is no necessary link or connection between religion and certain moral positions like disapproving of abortion or euthanasia or homosexuality. But I think at the same time there are all kinds of historical, psychological, educational, contingent connections between religions and certain moral positions, and we should also not ignore that. So the independence of morality from religion is true on a very principled level, but in practice on certain contingent levels, historical level, there is a link. What do you think about these three things?
All right, so I'll start at the end again. So breaking the links is those historically contingent links and recognizing the importance of the independence at the highest level. That is another bit of clearing up the debris for me. So there may be these links historically, they may endure, they may have an impact in the present. That impact in the present is to be, I think, resisted by breaking the linkages. As for Bishop Tutu, I would say there's a sense in which I agree with Bishop Tutu. If the law of God means here the moral law, that is the principles of, insofar as there are principles of morality, because one shouldn't actually, I think, necessarily believe that morality is this sort of axiomatic structure with a first principle from which everything can be derived. But morality as a practice is properly independent of the religious. And so if Bishop Tutu was pointing by the laws of God towards the practice of morality, I agree with him. If, on the other hand, he was asserting the priority of the first commandment over the second, then I think he was wrong. So if in Christianity, for those of you who weren't brought, as I was brought up with this, the first commandment is, that you should honor the Lord thy God. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it, love thy neighbor as thyself. It's the second one that actually is the biggie, and the first one is, well, we can talk about what you get out of going along with the first with the other one, and that's along the lines of my response to you earlier. But if that's what Tutu meant, then I think he was wrong. So who knows what he meant. I think I agreed completely with, as you were saying the first things, I agreed completely with them, but I have to confess I've now forgotten what they were. All I can remember is that I agreed with them. Oh, the alliance, yeah. Oh, absolutely. It was about the people who talk about tribal religion as real Christianity and real Islam and so forth. No, that's terrible. That's got. In a certain sense, new atheism acts as if that was so. The forms of religion that Dawkins and his friends bash are typically reduced to the lowest dimensions. Now, I have to say, they do have a defense against the charge that they are distorting religion, and it's the defense. I've heard it many times. I heard it at breakfast that day. Well, you may think that religion is a more sophisticated thing, but actually, the kinds of religion we're attacking and the kinds of religion we set up, that's very big in the world today. it's significant in the world today. Who knows whether it's a majority of the major world religions? But a sad piece of news is that it's gaining ground, and it's gaining ground especially in the global south, where religion with lots of sort of literalist elements in it seems to be on the rise.
Thank you. Unfortunately, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for all your questions.